ask you to get your last cup of coffee, those in the back, and come to your seats. I think we're going to have quite an exciting morning. I'm Jeff Cowan. I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School. On behalf of our school and also the School for Policy Planning and Development, I'm delighted to welcome all of you, and particularly our panelists, to this first quadrennial session on the California governor's race, a candid conversation about the messengers, and the media. And I really very much appreciate all the panelists being here. Some of them are on their way to another event in Sacramento later this morning, and so we're going to try to end this by 10:15 instead of 10:30 so that they can try to make their flight if their airline is still flying. But don't try to go to Las Vegas this morning. Of course, this is a public event, and it's being taped, and so everybody will know this is all on the record. I think one of the fun things about doing an event so soon after the election is that people's memories are fresh. Hopefully their passions are a little bit cooler, and nobody has any perspective yet. So it's the perfect time for us to be meeting. This was really the brainchild of the person who's going to be our moderator, the wonderful Cinny Kennard, a professor in the School of Journalism, which is part of the Annenberg School for Communication. Herself a leading reporter both at the international level, where she reported for CBS News in Moscow, London, and elsewhere, won a Columbia DuPont Award, and was later the top political correspondent, television political correspondent in Texas. We're lucky to have her as part of our faculty, and we're lucky to have her as the moderator today, Cinny Kennard.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Jeff. I just want to update our panel. As we had promised equal representation here, and we had promised that there would be somebody here from the Riordan campaign so we could address both the primary and the general election. But an email showed us this morning from Don Sipple, who had worked on the Riordan campaign, informing us that he was unable to make it due to an illness in his family. So I just want to let you all know that in the name of equal opportunity and equal representation here, because we probably will address the Riordan campaign, at least partially, that we did invite somebody and did only find out this morning that they were unable to attend. So just very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, these folks are gearing toward a flight very quickly. I'm just going to do quick bios. First of all, many of you know Bill Boyarsky. He's been a lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and is presently here at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication. He's a visiting scholar at the USC Political Science Department and certainly has written many books on politics. He's one of our lucky experts in the state of California, and I know you as well as I'm sure, are very conditioned to reading his columns in the Los Angeles Times as well. Next to Bill is Jeff Flint. Jeff is a veteran of both legislative and campaign operations for Republicans. He has served as chief of the staff to the former speaker, the executive director of the Assembly Republican Victory Fund, and president of Clint Nelson Associates. He's here with us this morning because he was a key operative in the Bill Simon for Governor campaign. Next to Bill is actually an old friend of mine from the days of the Bush 1 White House. Sean Walsh has a very long resume in politics. He's been a trusted advisor and top aide to California Governor Pete Wilson, a spokesman for President George Herbert Walker Bush, and he has more than a decade of leadership and experience in politics, government, and public policy, as well as business consulting. Sean is here in the capacity of both talking about Bill Jones for Governor campaign, as you will remember that during the primary, and he will also address Bill Simon. I move on to Sherry Bebitch Jeffe, a senior scholar at the University of Southern California School of Policy. I like to think of Sherry as the expert on California politics, and she's too humble to sort of tell you that, but Jeffe can be seen as a political analyst for KCAL, Channel 9 in Los Angeles, and works as a contributing editor for the California Journal. Right next to me here is the man who had the victory yesterday, and on Tuesday, and he worked very hard along with his staff. Garry South directed the 1998 campaign, also that resulted in the landslide election of the first Democratic governor of California in 20 years, and only the fourth in the entire 20th century. For his achievement, I can't leave this out for a number of reasons, primarily because I spent so much time in Texas alongside the person who I'm about to name, along with Garry South. For his achievement, he was named by the American Association of Political Consultants as Campaign Manager of the Year. In honor, he shares with Karl Rove, James Carville, and Lee Atwater. He's in some big company here. Welcome, everybody. Let's just start right away. What we want to do, first of all, quickly is look at the primary first. And we're going to ask for your questions as well as we go through this process. But let me start with Sean first, and let's talk about the primary. And what message did you attempt to communicate in the primary campaign? That is, what image did you try to project for your candidate, Bill Jones? And at least in part, because you didn't have victory, did you accomplish what you set out to do?
Well, actually, in some respects, whether we realize it or not, I was somewhat in partnership with Garry South in our objectives during the primary campaign. The truth does come out. Mr. Jones actually is a great guy, a long-time California political figure, very low-key, and steeped in policy. I mean, you can talk to him on many issues at long periods of time. If you go back on the history machine, for a variety of reasons, Mr. Jones had endorsed President Bush in the Republican primary election, then took his endorsement back and then transferred that endorsement to Senator McCain. That single act probably cost him more than any other act throughout his campaign the ability to become the Republican nominee.
Why?
It did because in the old days when Republicans used to raise money, they used to raise money through $100, $200, $1,000 campaign contributions from people broadly around the state. The Republican donor base now is much smaller. The Arduouses, the Spanoses, the Brands, etc., and then they go out in lower level tiers. And it's a hierarchical area, and I believe that deflection, whether the White House directly encouraged them not to give contributions or not, I don't have any evidence that they did, but it certainly sent a bad message to that group, and they refused to give them campaign contributions. No Bucks, no Buck Rogers. I mean, chase to the stars without rocket fuel. And so we had that issue that we really had to deal with, number one. Number two, there was also a perception that Bill Jones was too nice of a guy. He wasn't tough enough and strong enough to take Gray Davis on. And so we had to in some respects, invent his image and turn him into a very tough, aggressive politician. And in our hopes of doing that, then people would see, well, gosh, here's a guy who really potentially could be head-to-head with Gray, could take on the fundraising stuff, and could match him on the level of experience. And that hopefully would prime our fundraising pump, and then we could get TV on the air. We did, I think, achieve that. We did come on as tough enough to take Gray Davis on. We also simultaneously took on Dick Riordan and became the earned media equivalent of the attack dog by going after him for all of his campaign contributions to Democrats over the years. And these checks with Dick Riordan's name that just showed up in the media that didn't help or hurt us too much either, Gary. So we ran basically the earned media component of the attack on Dick Riordan, and they ran the paid media component of the attack on Dick Riordan. So in many respects, what I think did was help to undermine or destroy the Dick Riordan campaign, which we had to do. We had to beat Dick Riordan. We had to show we were tough enough to Gray Davis, and then hope the money came in and put money on the ads on the air for the last 2 weeks. Well, I think we did demonstrate we were very tough on Governor Davis. We hit him pretty hard on the energy conflict of interest stuff. We did really go after Dick Riordan, and I think in many respects helped to take him out with regards to the Democrats, because they started hemorrhaging votes after Dick Riordan came out and said he wouldn't support Dick Riordan. And so we did those three objectives, but we couldn't do is the third objective was get the money, get the paid TV. After Riordan really hit the skids at the Republican convention, our polling showed that he was hemorrhaging, just going down, spiraling. He could never recover. And we believed that if we had money to put in the air, we could demonstrate to the broad-based electorate that Bill Jones is the leader that they would want to support. We didn't have the money. We couldn't get the money. They put $5 million on TV up there, raised his profile, and they became us, and then Mr. Simon became the nominee. So I think in many respects, between the two of us, that's why you got Simon. Yeah. So.
Before we move on, I just wanted you to assess, and just very briefly, how much you would either blame the White House or fault the White House, whatever, for stepping in and basically manipulating and eventually destroying Jones. Sean.
Look, I don't blame the White House. I mean, look, California has 55 electoral votes. The Republican Party has some very serious issues, although most of the people out here believe this Republican Party is this large, monolithic organization that generates candidates and policy and everything else. It's really not. It's a weak structure system. It's more candidate driven. But, look, they wanted to win the state. They want to continue to have fundraising going on here. I think they believed that was the best candidate, so they encouraged the guy to run. And the truth of the matter is, I don't think they were vindictive in punishing us, but they certainly weren't enthusiastic saying, hey, that's my boy, patting him on the back and say, all is forgiven. I mean, politics is the beauty of this thing is it's the ultimate Darwinian deal. If you like sports or football, and you don't sit on the couch like Al Bundy, you go into politics, so you can do it every day. You just don't get the physical contact, it's the verbal and intellectual stuff. So it's a rough and tumble world, and you make a mistake, you get blown up, and you're dead. And so we made a mistake. Now I think Bill Jones can come back. I think he still has a political future if he wants it. But in this case, he made that fatal mistake. The donors wouldn't give us money, and that's probably why he wasn't the nominee.
Jeff, briefly, explain to us what the communicated message was from the campaign about your candidate. I mean, you had a newcomer who had never been on this landscape before.
That's true.
And?
Well, the way we viewed the primary was we had our two opponents were one candidate that was, in our opinion, was never going to have the money to communicate a message, and the other candidate was going to communicate a message that was contrary to the Republican primary electorate. So we felt like there was plenty of room for Bill Simon, who would be able to communicate a message and have it be a little bit more in tune with what a Republican primary electorate was going to be willing to vote for. Similar to what Sean said, there was certainly some conspiracy and unspoken or sometimes spoken alliance between our campaign and the Davis campaign to undermine the Riordan campaign as well. And we don't need to pick on the Riordan campaign too much without Don here to defend it. But it was always, somewhat our puzzlement that
Go ahead, Jeff.
That the, I think one of the hardest things you have to do, which Gary's very good at, Sean's very good at, I'd like to think I'm okay at it, in politics is separating the message that you communicate to political insiders to the message that you communicate to real people. And the Riordan campaign never seemed to be able to get out of the mode of communicating to insiders. I mean, running a Republican primary ad that says I'm a nonpartisan problem solver and I'm the candidate that Gray Davis fears the most, it made no sense. And so we saw it was the mistakes that the Riordan campaign made, the inability of the Jones campaign to raise any money. And frankly, to answer the question that you asked to Sean also, if you look at what the White House did for other races around the country where they picked a candidate and they said that we want this candidate, we think this candidate has the best chance to win, to their credit out here, I think they figured out the flawed nature of the Riordan candidacy, and they did not do nearly as much as we could have for him. The president never officially endorsed Dick Riordan, which they did in a number of contested races around the country. They never sent anybody out to really raise money from him. There's no doubt that the Bush White House sent some signals. There's no doubt that the Bush donor base in California was for Riordan. Fortunately, I was working for a candidate that had the ability to self-finance a big chunk of his primary. And we picked a message that in terms of we clearly wanted to be conservative in the primary. We tried to keep an eye on focusing on issues that would not hurt us for the general election. So I think there was only one instance in a public setting in the primary where Bill Simon said the words, I am pro-life. He always talked about tax cuts, job creation, more competition in schools. So we tried to focus our conservative message on areas where we would not cause ourselves too much difficulty for the general election. And then we tried to overcome the issue of whether or not Bill Simon had any experience by talking about how he had a different kind of experience and this was the right time for a political outsider. So we focused on three areas of Bill's background, his business record, his record working with Rudy Giuliani, and then in terms of broadening him out, we talked a lot about his charitable work and how he was a conservative that cared about people and had a long and demonstrated record of caring about people and wanting and getting into politics as a continuation of a commitment to public service that Bill had and actually had demonstrated through most of his adult life. So we largely due to the fact that Jones' campaign was more aggressive on the earned media side and the media focused on the Riordan campaign a lot as, again, the insider message, the candidate that Gray Davis feared the most. We we were able to communicate our message largely without, having a lot of shots fired at us. That certainly helped us in the primary as well. And in the end, again, we viewed ourselves, we were the candidate that had a message compatible with the Republican primary electorate and money to deliver it. The other two campaigns lacked one of those two criteria, and that's, I think, why we won the primary. Again, as Sean pointed out, really the kind of the breaking point for the Riordan campaign was definitely the Republican primary. That's where, despite all of the advertising Garry had done, there was a little bit of cynicism that I detected in the Republican primary elections that we're a little troubled by these things that are being said on TV about Riordan, but we know it's Gray Davis Phantoms, and we don't like him, so we're not sure what to do about this. And then as soon as Governor Duke Mason came out on behalf of Bill Jones and said Dick Riordan is unacceptable as a Republican choice, and then the Republican voters at the straw poll there overwhelmingly voted for Bill Simon, and actually Carla's paper had the best headline. It said, I forget what the headline was, but the Monday after the Republican convention, there was just a screamer headline that said, Republicans repudiate Riordan or Republicans reject Riordan, and from there it became okay for Republicans to dislike Dick Riordan, and all of the undermining, all of the water under the foundations that Garry's advertising had done, it just broke the dam. Once Republicans were out there saying, don't vote for Dick Riordan, all of the weakening that Garry's advertising had done, the dam just collapsed, and we went from 5% to 50% almost overnight.
Garry, I have to ask you to respond to that directly, and in the course of that, maybe you can also talk about what kind of message. First of all, also, these are a lot of explanations for why it all went wrong on that side of the table. It's pretty accurate what they've been saying. And did it make your job a lot easier?
Well, yeah, and I want to, for the first time, publicly acknowledge my unindicted co-conspirators over here for their fine work in the primary and the Republican primary. Let me just walk back a bit and talk about Riordan for a second. In May of 2001, most of you might recall, there was an article in the LA Times. It was Dick Riordan's birthday. I don't know what, it's the 1st of May, I believe. And the president had called Riordan to wish him happy birthday. And out of that call came a story in the LA Times saying, President urges Riordan to run for governor. Now, I've never said this publicly before, so I'm going to share a new tidbit of information with you. But when that story hit, I got a call from somebody in Riordan's office that I know well, who's very close to Riordan, who said to me, I'm sure you saw the story in today's LA Times. Don't pay any attention to it. This is just Dick on a little end-of-term ego trip. He's feeling the pangs and the pains of having to leave office. He likes the spotlight. And in fact, I was in the room. This is this person saying to me, I was in the room. I was in Dick's office when the call came in from President Bush, and President Bush did not bring up the subject of Dick Riordan running for governor. It was Dick Riordan who brought up the subject to the president of Dick Riordan running for governor, and said something to the effect, people have been saying I should run for governor. What do you think? And of course, Bush, being a rather affable person, said, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Now, I can't tell you what happened from that point forward. But what I can tell you is that in my judgment, and it squares with what Sean and Jeff pointed out, despite the perception that the White House, this was the handpicked candidate of the White House, you didn't really see in the Riordan campaign a lot of elements, a lot of backroom maneuvering to deliver anything to Dick Riordan. And I think partially that was because as they watched the guy perform out on the campaign trail, this was not a reassuring thing. Karl Rove is not an idiot. I mean, you don't elect the president of the United States if you're an idiot. You don't take back the Senate as they did on Tuesday if you're an idiot. And all that was Karl Rove's design. So it was never clear to me that Riordan really had the support of the White House. And that's one of the reasons we decided, by the way, once he got into it, which was a surprise to me. I thought the guy would basically, kind of romance this idea, string it out as long as he could, get a bunch of headlines, getting people saying, oh, Dick, you have to run, you're the savior of the party. But he ultimately would not run. And frankly, I was personally surprised when he decided to get into it. One of the things I was told by the person who called me out of the Riordan office was, knowing that I had a previous relationship with Riordan that was not particularly positive, was to say, look, don't attack the guy. I know your instinct is, the guy reared his head, says he's going to run for governor, you're going to go out there to rip his head off. Just keep cool, just bite your tongue, and this thing's all going to go away. It's never going to happen. Well, I bit my tongue for about 3 months, and ultimately what happened was Dick Riordan, much to my surprise, and I think that of a lot of Republicans, decided, well, why the hell not? I'm going to get in it and run for governor. Now, once he got in it, and let's fast forward to the primary itself. Once he got in it, I never really thought he was a one-point cinch in the Republican primary. We had moved back to a closed Republican primary from the open primary we had in 1998. In 1998, Ray Davis came in first among 2 Democrats and the eventual Republican nominee in the primary because we got 15% of the Republicans voting for us in the primary. We got a large number of independents voting for us in the primary, and we ended up number 1 of the 4 candidates running. But the Supreme Court threw out the open primary, so we were back to basically a closed Republican primary. And I never thought that Riordan, really from his 2 experiences running for mayor of L.A., which in some cases was successful, I never thought that he extrapolated from those experiences the right things. First of all, it's a nonpartisan race when you run for mayor of Los Angeles. It's essentially an open primary. I was involved in the race against him in '93, working for then Councilman Mike Wu. And I thought that Riordan thought, and I think this is in fact what he concluded, was that because he, as a Republican, he had won the mayorship of this hugely democratic city twice and won overwhelmingly both times, somehow that made him into a political leviathan. But the fact is, he beat 2 people, one of whom I work for, and I have respect for both of them, but he beat 2 people that were so weak that in the last primary that was held in 2001, both of them got beat running for city council in L.A. So the fact is he had exceedingly weak opponents. He outspent them overwhelmingly, and he slopped into office. And he I think, incorrectly and rather arrogantly extrapolated from that experience that sometimes he would be a great candidate for governor. Now, once he got in it, our imperative was essentially to make sure he did not zip through that primary unscathed and untouched and come out of it with a lead on us, which, if that had happened, would have probably engaged the White House, engaged national Republican donors who thought he was probably the best candidate in a general election to run against Gary Davis, and that the more money than God has would be flooding in here from Republican sources to take out Davis. When we looked at his primary opposition, Bill Jones and Bill Simon, we concluded that for those of you who know Spanish, that Bill Jones probably would have the cojones but not the cash to go after Dick Riordan, and that Bill Simon would have the cash but not the cojones to go after Dick Riordan. So if anyone was going to do it, we would have to do it, and we obviously didn't have too much compunction about doing so. The way we chose to do it was I think, considered somewhat unorthodox when we put up the first spot, and even some Democratic consultants were publicly, usually anonymously, saying, what's wrong with the Davis campaign? Are they out of their mind? They have taken and put up a spot that accuses Dick Riordan of being right to life in a Republican primary, which is basically filled with right to life voters. Why are they helping him?
Sweat.
That's going to help him. That's not going to hurt him. That's going to help him. But what they didn't know was we had planned this out in advance. We had 2 shoes to drop. One was a spot that essentially pointed out that he had given personal contributions to pretty radical right-to-life groups earlier in his career, and he had been a co-chair, national co-chair of the campaign to confirm Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, who was a rabid anti-choicer who wanted to do in Roe v. Wade and raise something like $400,000 for that effort, and that he had supported a huge number of right-to-life candidates around the country, Republican senators who are rabidly pro-life. And in a sense, when we focused that spot with pro-lifers and pro-choicers, it made both of them a little uncomfortable because the whole centerpiece of the Riordan campaign, if you remember, was I'm different because I'm a pro-choice Republican. And his wife, who's a Democrat, was out there working all of her gaggle of friends in the west side of L.A. saying, Dick can save the Republican Party because he can bring women back to the party. He's pro-choice. He's openly pro-choice. He's avowedly pro-choice. So that was really the centerpiece of the entire campaign. I'm a different kind of Republican because I'm pro-choice, and I'm willing to stand up and say that I as a Republican, support a woman's right to choose. And that's going to save the Republican Party. That means I can be competitive with Davis. It means I can bring women flooding back to the party, and it means that I can save the Republican Party in California. Now, once that spot hit, there was a little bit of unease on the Democratic side because people, as I said, thought, well, wait a minute. He's running as a pro-choice Republican, which probably hurts him in the Republican primary. Now Davis is telling everybody that actually he has a pro-life background, But what they didn't know was the second shoe that was about to drop was a videotape that I'd collected in the 1993 mayor's race. It was taken in 1991 on a cable show in Beverly Hills, where Dick Riordan, right to camera, said, when asked about abortion, that he agreed 100% with the Catholic Church on its position on abortion, and that as a matter of fact, as somebody who was rather liberal on a wide variety of issues, he surprised himself with the level of his emotion on the abortion issue because he thinks it's murder, and that's what he said on the videotape. We had concocted a two-spot mix, a kind of a two-step, that we were going to throw out on the guy, knowing that once we pushed out there the first spot, accusing him of having right-to-life connections and right-to-life leanings, he would have to publicly deny it as vociferously as he possibly could, which in and of itself was going to alienate some of the Republican voter base. And then when the second shoe dropped and people saw on the air all over television in the state of California, this guy who's out there pumping himself as an avowedly pro-choice candidate, saying himself, his own voice, his own face, that he agreed 100% with the Catholic Church, that he thought abortion was murder. People were aghast in focus groups, whether you were pro-life or pro-choice. That kind of a flip-flop on an issue as fundamental and as emotional as abortion made the guy seem like an absolutely abject phony. Either he was a pro-lifer who was trying to delude people into thinking he was pro-choice, or he had literally changed his position on the issue for political reasons, knowing that a pro-lifer doesn't do well in California. And I think that was the beginning of the end. Now, I do agree with Jeff that the other thing that happened that really changed the dynamic of the primary was the day that that Dick Riordan insulted George Deukmejian at the state Republican convention, with George Deukmejian sitting there right in the audience. This guy's an icon among conservative Republicans in California. And secondly, when you have four former state Republican chair people come forward at the same time and say that they could not possibly support Dick Riordan if he was the nominee of the Republican Party, that was the end. Because what it did is, we had established a lot of doubts in people's minds about this guy's credibility and about his genuineness. And a lot of Republicans were kind of backing off saying, boy, I don't know about this guy. When George Deukmejian came out and said Davis is better than Riordan, which I'm assuming probably hit Republicans pretty hard, and when the former chairs said, I can't support Dick Riordan, it gave Republicans who had doubts, growing doubts about him anyway, a license to leave him in droves and go to another candidate. And that's essentially what happened in the primary.
I want to add one thing real quick there, too. The one thing that also happened, but it was strategically set up that circumstance with Deukmejian. Then we put up the ads with Deukmejian coming out and going after Riordan. So we didn't have the buyer frequency. We bought in high Republican areas and cable markets to do that. But Riordan himself went out. It's like he went away in the weekend. He mellowed out towards the end of the week. He came back re-energized to go out and in public stick his finger in high-propensity conservative primary voters. You're dinosaurs, you're out of touch, you're destroying the party, and it happened week after week after week. And these people who were willing to hold their nose and support him, who didn't like Greg Davis, they were tolerating his ads here, but literally Deukmejian comes out and says, not only can I support him, I won't support him. And the Chronicle ran a big piece about the fact that Riordan gave money to Willie Brown, and helped to be Kurt Kringle defeated and another person defeated. He just literally hammered. But Riordan drove his own message, and his own message was to attack conservative Republican primary voters. It was the craziest thing you ever saw.
It's generally not a successful primary strategy when your message is to say to your primary voters upon whom you have to count to be nominated, if you don't change your deeply held positions and come around to my point of view, you're going to die a slow, agonizing death. That is not a particularly compelling message to primary voters on either side of the aisle.
Now, everybody, that kind of goes to my question. It's an academic one, but I'm curious to know what you guys think about what might have happened. Would the outcome have been different if we had still had the open primary?
I think the volume against Riordan and the margin might not have been the same. I don't think Riordan would have won. Even in an open primary. I mean, you got to remember that it was a semi-close primary. Declined to state voters, which is 15% or so of the state. still had the option to pick to vote either in a Republican or a Democrat primary. There was no interest for an independent voter to go vote in a Democrat primary. There was nothing really driving interest over there. So independents that were inclined to vote in a partisan primary in March of this year were voting for the most part, I think, in the Republican primary, and that's probably what kept Riordan within 18 points, if anything, because if it had been a pure close primary, we probably would have beat him by 30 points.
He destroyed himself so badly there that he could not have gotten enough Republicans, even if you had 8% crossover of Democrats, to get over the line anyway. So I don't think it would have made a difference.
Could we move away from that for a second? Garry, I want to ask you, how serious did you consider the possibility of attacks on Davis's fundraising, right from the beginning? Did you consider that a danger? If not, why not? Were you surprised when it really didn't happen until very late?
Well,
Can you use a different analogy besides the toilet bowl, too?
Dog in the toilet bowl.
Because I don't want to visualize that anymore.
as somebody who's been around this business for 30 years, I will tell you that political fundraising is always criticized. It's criticized by the press. It's criticized by your opponents. I've been in races where I've been vastly outspent, and I've been in races where I've vastly outspent the opponent. I've never seen a single race, short of having the candidate arrested and hauled away in handcuffs, where fundraising ever became a determinative issue. It's a huge issue with the press, and my friends in the press down here know I've said this a million times. It's a huge thing for editorial writers. Tut, 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 cluck, 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 money in politics, terrible, unethical, over the line, corruption, yada, yada, yada. But to the average voter, it means nothing. They think all politicians are corrupt. And as a matter of fact, when we would focus group Bill Simon and Gray Davis in our own focus groups, I mean, people were kind of vaguely aware of the fact that Davis was raising a lot of money, and there had been questions raised about whether he was doing favors for his contributors. But when you pushed people and you said, well, is Davis doing anything different than any other politician does? They go, nah, they're all corrupt. They all do it. It's just part of the game. Would Simon be any better if he was there? No, he'd be just as corrupt as Davis. It's just not a determinative issue, except the people in the government community, the common causes of the world and the Bob Stearns of the world, and political pundits who have nothing more to cluck about, and editorial writers who just legitimately do not believe in private money in politics. How far they're staying.
I'm standing up not to rise above the panel, but just to be able to have microphone possibilities here. I want to be sure before it gets to it, you'll have to run out, that we go to the audience and some questions you might have. I know there's some folks that are running around with microphones here, and I want to just before I see the person about to respond to what Garry said, so maybe Bob.
Cash registers at 10 feet.
Yes.
Actually, I agree with Garry. In a sense, it's not the biggest issue in a campaign. But the question for Garry is, if you had been running the Simon campaign, how would you have won the election for Simon?
Well, it's I've been asked that question before, as you might imagine. I don't think it was possible for Simon to win this campaign, and I said that at an AAPC conference in March down in San Diego when some of the press folks who are here today were also there. I mean, Bill Simon had 3 strikes against him from day one. The first one is a governor of California has not been defeated, as you know, running for a second term since 1942, 60 years ago. Democrats, Republicans, no matter what the economy was doing, no matter what the job ratings were, incumbent governors of California get reelected to second terms. I don't suppose that that's going to be true forever, but it might happen at some point. But history's not on your side when you take on a sitting governor of California. It's a huge, huge challenge, particularly for someone with no electoral experience, no base, and no real political instincts learned from years of working in the system. The second strike he had against him was that, California only twice in the last 100 years has elected a governor who had not previously served in elective office. It was Ronald Reagan in '66 and Hiram Johnson in 1910. And, in my objective opinion, Bill Simon certainly did not rise to the level of Ronald Reagan in 1966 or Hiram Johnson in 1910, both of whom, although they hadn't been in elective office, were already well-known figures in California in their own right when they ran for governor. I mean, the third strike he had against him was, we haven't elected anybody in the top of the ticket race in California, meaning president, governor, or U.S. senator, who was anti-choice since George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988, 14 years ago. And frankly, we didn't really have to pull that out of the quiver all that much in this race because people just assumed he was wrong on the issue. We used a little bit in San Francisco, some on the Central Coast, a little bit in L.A., but unlike what we were expected to do, we didn't flog the social issues the whole time because we thought we had a better package of issues that resonated even better with a broader spectrum of voters on all the business sleaze stuff that we threw at Simon. So, I mean, I think he had 3 strikes against him from day one. I don't think there was any way for him ever to put this over the top, no matter what he did or how much money he spent or what he said about Bill Davis.
Yes. Yeah, Jeff, in all fairness here, Jeff, do you just want to briefly, so we can go to another?
You can, since one of the things that we did in the Simon campaign is brought in people that we like from both the Jones campaign and the Riordan campaign after the primary to try to round out our team because we were definitely, we were definitely a little bit of an insurgent campaign in the primary. And so Sean joined our campaign after the primary, so he can add on. But, obviously I disagree. I think there's, we had some, we made a couple of mistakes as I think every campaign made, and also we had some areas that we just had some bad luck that I think probably spelled a little bit of a difference. I think we got a couple of things that we wanted. I think there was clearly a little bit of a Republican tide on Election Day. It wasn't a 94 tide, but it was. There was a little bit of a pull in our direction. Garry can talk a little bit more about what they had and what they stumbled upon. I don't think. I think the IRS tax shelter issue was a very lucky break for them. I think the fraud verdict was a very lucky break for them. I mean, well, you've said this before. I just want to bad break for us. Were you even aware of that trial? I think I've seen you send it.
We were not.
I mean, so, I think if you take those two away, which, a lot of, again, Garry's criticized the press for focusing too much on fundraising, and Garry knows to a certain extent I agree with what he said. For us, fundraising was always an issue while we were short on cash to get our friends in the media to write bad things about Gray Davis until we could afford to be on TV. So, we played the same game. I don't think anybody in the Simon campaign ever thought that we were going to beat Gray Davis solely on ethics. We thought it was a way to undermine the governor and soften him up for the issues that we hoped to beat him with, and B, again, when we were short on cash, it was a way to at least generate some headlines against him in the meantime. But I think if you took away the IRS tax shelter issue, which I think A, was completely bogus, and B, they stumbled upon, and you take away the fraud verdict, which never should have happened, and the judge clearly, determined that 6 weeks later, but it was an awfully difficult 6 weeks. I think to take those away, is that worth 5% of the vote? Is that worth 300,000 votes? I think it is. So, despite what Garry said, I think those two issues probably were worth 300,000 votes, and they were. With all due respect to Garry's brilliance, they weren't things that he did. They were just bad luck, and campaigns have bad luck sometimes. Those are a couple things that happened that, if they hadn't happened, I think you would have had a different outcome.
Speaking of bad luck, have you heard of the energy crisis?
Sean, you wanted to, let me just let Sean have a word.
Briefly, I think, for the most part, Garry's analysis is right. I do think it was a unique year, and I do think, just as you said, the energy crisis changed the fundamental dynamics. Normally, the way the state goes, abortion and guns are very potent and powerful issues, and I think you were smart for not emphasizing them this time out, because I think I would have put jobs in the economy, which hasn't still fully settled, but people are very unsettled about that issue now, the energy crisis, and still some problems with the education issue up against abortion and guns. And I think at the end of the day, that those issues were more of a fundamental issue, particularly when we tried to avoid saying that we were going to deal with the abortion issue. It's the law of the land, we'll let it go. I think we could have gotten away with that. I think our problem was, and I think literally, and you can't talk until I'm finished here, so I believe the only reason Gray Davis...
I have to gag him while you talk.
The only reason Gray Davis is governor and will be governor for 4 more years is because the guy's sitting right here. And the bottom line was, whether we like it or not, if you were probably chief of staff in the governor's office, they wouldn't have made some of the problems they made with the Ravi Mehta and some of the other staff issues. But it wasn't a rainstorm, the computer stuff that passed. It was something that went on consistently
throughout a long period of time, and the earned media certainly gave us a break on that issue, not just Oracle, but the computer stuff. And so this was an underlying issue from an earned media perspective. If you keep hearing it over and over and over again, long enough for over a year, then it sinks in. And I do believe that the reason why it was at 5 percentage points was because we used the ethics and the campaign fundraising, et cetera, and then married those up with policy issues that either were addressed or inadequately addressed. And I think that fundamentally it wasn't designed to really bring Republicans out, but to hold Democrat voters down. And I think that's why it was 5 points. I think it was a very effective strategy. And I do have a complaint with the good government people. Mr. Stern was up there a little bit, but you didn't hear much from really anybody else, an occasional quote in the newspaper. Now, I think where we could have made significant inroads and impacts is that the day after the campaign, I went on with Cinny. She put me on Life and Times, and I said, here's some free advice to the Simon campaign. Get out there right now and define who you are. You're an empty vessel. You came on in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Nobody knows you. And if, again...
and they didn't.
Well, but there's reasons, and I'll let Jeff explain that. I wasn't on the campaign until 3 months after that. But I would have brought Simon down on the beach with the wife and kids and then shown him surfing and said, I love this coast. I love this state. I came here. It's the land of opportunity. I want clean oceans. Done a big environmental policy and really softened himself up and made him not a scary Republican, and got out there very quickly and put in the bank goodwill to define who he was. And I think part of our problem, and I think Jeff will address it principally because we had no money after the campaign was over, we let 2-3 months go by, and Garry, I don't know if he had a doppel research done or not, from an earned media perspective, we were a new car. And so every couple of days you'd see in the press Garry or Dave or Roger kicking a dent in the door, using a key to scratch the paint. So after 2 months, we weren't that new, pristine car anymore. We were a little bit damaged. And then when they came forward with their paid media attacking on the business stuff, plus you had Arthur Anderson and you had all the national business stuff, and it just fed right into that whole earned media stuff, that we were defined before we could define ourselves. And in being so defined, again, here's my beef with the good government and the journalists. Well, why aren't you out there saying great things about how you want to save, the world for mutton pie and apple pie and education? By the time we were defined, you are going with your policy stuff through that prism, and then the voters are not necessarily taking you with the level, they're looking at you through skepticism, and they say, oh, BS. I don't necessarily believe you. So you can't get the traction with a lot of the policy stuff you want, because you've been so damaged through the paid media side. And I'm curious to hear what Garry has to say. I think later on in the campaign, when I know at least from our polls, when you pulled off the negative stuff and just put the positive stuff, we had a number of pollsters doing it, but your numbers dipped significantly. And so, at least from our polls. And I think that he had the same problem. He had the same problem because I think that a lot of people looked at Greg Davis, and I know you said you didn't know Greg Davis, still people like him, but he had all that baggage over those 2-year periods that really defined him with the media, and I don't think he could break through with the positive message. So Garry did what he had to do, which was destroy Bill Simon from a paid media perspective, and he was relentless, and he did it. And so what we had to do was try and hurt him as badly as possible, get Democrats to not show up in great numbers, hope Republicans didn't protect coastal Republicans, women, in appreciable enough numbers, and hope people would take a leap of faith saying that I just don't like the way it's going here. I'm willing to take a chance on a new guy who might take us in a different direction. So I think that sums it up.
Before Garry, you got so many compliments, right?
Well, it's true, though.
No, I'm not. I'm being.
Democratic registration edge also played a role in this. I mean, there is a 10-point Democratic registration.
Well, that's why we want the whole Democrats from showing up at the polls, though.
Right.
Let me just ask if there's any more questions on primary issues before we move on, because I know we're going to slide into the general in a minute. Exactly. Sir, very quickly. Garry, you want to go ahead because it's your.
Well, yeah, because when Riordan got into it, we did focus groups all over the state talking about him. And remember, never one time in the whole 150-year history of the state of California have we ever elected a mayor or ex-mayor of L.A. governor of the state, ever. We've elected mayors of San Diego and San Francisco, but never L.A., and that's not an accident. Riordan, I think, assumed that because he had this big base, so to speak, down here, that somehow that would translate into pretty high statewide name ID. but it's not positive name ID, basically, outside of the LA media market, not just LA City, but the LA media market. It's a huge downside, even in the Bay Area. Even in the Bay Area, which is very liberal, they have this thing against LA. They think we're the big 800-pound gorilla. We suck up all the money out of Sacramento and suck up all the publicity, and they're higher tone than we are, and they're more culturally sophisticated than we are.
No, he's absolutely
right, Carla? But it doesn't play well outside of LA, and that would have been one of his problems in a general election. It would have complicated our ability in LA, LA market, to run a campaign against him because he's actually quite well thought of here. People thought he was a pretty successful mayor, maybe a little bumbling, but avuncular and well-meaning, and worked for $1 a year, and was overwhelmingly elected and overwhelmingly reelected, and all that. So it would have complicated our ability to try to tell a story about him in this media market, because people were very resistant, and we had a lot of spots in the can about his record as mayor of L.A. We didn't use them for the most part. We didn't use any of them in L.A. because they didn't work down here. People were just very resistant to the notion somehow he was a failed mayor, he screwed things up or left things, in a shambles. So it would have complicated our life, although I think we would have beat him ultimately. The guy didn't hold up very well over a 3-month primary campaign. It's pretty hard for me to see how he would have held up better over an 8-month general election campaign, because it was nice to throw him in like the field poll did a few weeks out and show him, everyone's choice because they didn't like Davis and Simon. But that was in the absence of what would have been done to him starting in June by us. Right. So, it was all hypothetical and almost kind of ridiculous to throw him in there.
Could I ask just that if you do have questions, you wait for a microphone so that the panel and everybody else can hear. Now. After all that, right?
I read that you predicted Davis would win by 9 to 12%. He only won by 5%. Right on the
8 to 12.
And at one point he said 20 again.
Do you really consider this a victory? And I'd love to know. You're a very straightforward guy. You must have gone, oh my God, I was wrong.
No, here's what happened. It's pretty clear now. We've got 2 days to look at the returns. Our tracking regularly showed us up by double digits. But if anyone who understands polling knows, there are certain assumptions you have to make when you poll. And one of the assumptions we made was about the spread between Democrats versus Republicans on Election Day. You have to make that calculation, otherwise the polling is useless. Now, we started out with about a 9-point spread in our own tracking. As it became clear that our base was not particularly energized, we started pulling that down. We pulled it down to 7, and then the last 2 days we were doing 450 a night, meaning Sunday and Monday, and we pulled it down to 3, to a 3-point spread. Now, when we pulled it down to a 3-point spread, here's what happened. Davis ended up with a 6-point margin, and then if you took the undecideds and looked at crosstabs, found out who they were, where they lived, what their party registration was, what they felt about Davis, how they felt about Simon, and you allocated those as best you could, Simon actually picked up a point, which meant it was 5. So walking in there on election night, we knew exactly what was going to happen here because we understood the turnout was going to be low. On election night didn't surprise us. We knew we were going to win. We knew it would be a single-digit spread. And, turnout was extremely low. We got, if you look at L.A. County and the Bay Area counties, we got huge margins, but they're margins that were applied against the diminished voter base. So as Alameda was coming in and L.A. County was coming in, we kept looking at how much of the vote was in, hoping that the spread would widen, but it wasn't because it was applied against a much reduced voter base. And that's, as Sherry said, the fact we have about a 10% spread here between D's and R's in California is really what brought this thing home. If this had been a fairly equally registered state, we could have easily gone down. It was only the fact there are more of us than there are of them that pulled us that thing out on election night. Let's face it, we won all 8 statewide offices. One of them is still essentially not confirmed, but I think when all is said and done, Steve Wesley will be controller of California. And if you look at what happened elsewhere in the country, despite the margins in each of these races, this was a incredible Democratic sweep when you look at what happened in the rest of the country. In January, by the way, just for the record, California will be the only state in the United States of America, the only state among the 50, that has both U.S. Senate seats held by Democrats, a congressional majority held by Democrats, all statewide constitutional offices, including the governor, held by Democrats, and both houses of the legislature held by Democrats. The only state in America.
and that has nothing to do with the fact that this is a Democrat state. What Gary's very good at, he's doing it again to the folks here in the front row, is he's trying to convince all of the donors in the state to continue to not give money to Republicans.
How are we doing so far?
He's actually very good at it. He's extremely good at it. He did it to Dick Riordan in the primary. He did very well against us in the general election. And with all due respect to Gary's 3 strikes, the difference was a little bit of a voter registration advantage here and about a $50 million funding advantage, which, there's a reason Gary spends all of his time being friendly to you guys and talking about, and he's telling you what this great Democrat state we're in. This state is not as liberal as Massachusetts, which has a Republican governor now. But the difference is clearly the funding difference. And if I can pick on my friends in the press a little bit more,
I'll give you equal.
We had some, there was some disdain written in a couple of the process stories about how the Simon campaign keeps saying this race is closer, and Gary's the evil genius, and his poll says they're going to win by 14 points, and that must be true because Gary's really smart, and Gary is very smart. But we had our campaign strategy, as Sean said, was based on, you win in the state. We can win by getting crossover votes, or if the electorate in California has become a little bit more partisan, or you can win if you're a Republican by suppressing Democrat turnout, and that's ugly. And everybody say what a horrible person you are for suppressing Democrat turnout, but that's how you win. And we're paid to try to win campaigns for our candidates. And so we had to assume somewhat in our polling that it was true. And our pollster, who did our tracking for the final several weeks of the campaign, Jan van Lohausen, Gary was very effective of minimizing that, and probably cost us a few $1 million by convincing all of our friends in the press to write that Republicans are clinging to polls that show the race is tightening, but everybody knows that those polls aren't true. Well, those polls were true. The margin was a lot closer, and it was because we did our job to the best of our ability to do so. And I think campaign finance played a part of that, of making a marginal Democrat voter who clearly was never going to vote for Bill Simon disgusted enough with Greg Davis that they decided not to vote in that election, not show up and vote, and that was why we always modeled the election on a closer spread, and why Jan's polls were accurate is because we were successful in that. We weren't successful enough at it, but the reason the race was at 5 points rather than 14 points is because of that. And again, I think with a couple of things different, I think we had a shot of winning.
But Jeff, let me just say this. One of the problems you had with your polling is you guys put out bogus polls from beginning to end. You had a poll out the week after the primary showing Simon up by 8 points, which was ludicrous. I had the questionnaire, and secondly, then right at the end, you put out a poll saying he's up by 3.5 when everybody knew that was not the case. Well, we weren't lying about our polls.
There was a slight flaw, and we admitted that publicly.
Slight flaw?
No, hold on. Let me finish. There was a slight flaw in the POS poll that came out right after the primary that had us up 7. I don't think anybody in our camp thought we were up 7. There was a couple of questions that were asked before the ballot question which shouldn't have been, and I agree with that. But there were public polls that had us ahead. There's a field or a PPIC poll that has us up too.
No.
Yeah, there was.
No. Before the primary, the field poll had you up in one poll 44 to 42 before the primary.
Right.
There was never a single public poll that ever had you leading after the primary, except that one Survey USA poll at the end of July, which showed you up like 1.3 points.
Right.
No. That was it. There was never another public poll that showed you up.
No, but there was also no public poll done right after the primary.
Okay.
If you had done a public poll on March 15th, I bet it would have showed us ahead or tied.
The point is, when you lie about your polling over and over again, people are not going to believe you when you lie the 15th time.
Okay. Let me hear from Carla, who is here from the San Francisco Chronicle, because it's time for the press to have a word.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Gary, given how close it was against a candidate who had many major problems and even was criticized by Republicans, how tough would it have been to run a Jones-Davis campaign? And Sean, how would that have turned out in your view?
Me first? Well, Sean heard me say this to his face many times in the primary. I thought Jones of the three was clearly the best candidate. We suspected he could never raise the money to win. But, Jones falls into the pattern of the kinds of candidates that win governorships in California. I mean, when you look back, you have Earl Warren, who's a sitting attorney general, winning the governorship. You had George Deukmejian, a sitting attorney general, winning the governorship. You had Pat Brown, a sitting attorney general, winning the governorship. Jerry Brown, a secretary of state, winning the governorship. Pete Wilson, a sitting senator, and Gray Davis, former controller and lieutenant governor. This is not a state that takes kindly to people parachuting in here out of nowhere and, saying, hey, I want to be your governor. Jones had a legislative record. He'd been minority leader in the assembly. He'd been a good secretary of state for 2 terms. And frankly, and I said this, I think, at the Republican convention in front of Sean and some of you reporters, that of the 3 candidates at that point, I thought Jones was the only one running anything that resembled a real campaign. He was hitting this every day. If Jones had the money to go on the air in the primary against us, like we did against Riordan, with the accusations he was making against us, it would have dented us pretty badly. He had the package of credentials that voters would have, I think, looked at seriously, probably too conservative ultimately, but that voters would have looked at seriously and put him in the mix of somebody that, yeah, I can see him being the governor of California.
Bill.
I have a question. Why was it that I've just didn't cover the campaign, being out of the business now, and being a good government type working for Bob Stern over at the Center for Governmental Studies.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that when I...
Yeah, well, no, that's all right. I plead guilty to that. Why was it that the state budget crisis, the county hospital crisis in Los Angeles County, the threatened closing of the hospitals, why was it that I didn't read or see, they wasn't covered much on television, read about any of this in the campaign? Why wasn't it mentioned? I mean...
Can I add a corollary to that? Because that was sort of my question. It has been the most issueless campaign I have ever observed, and what I'd like to know from everybody in this room, whose fault is it? You guys or the media?
When I say, when I say issueless, I mean, the issues you talked about were very generic issues, like I'm a businessman, and or I'm a governor, and I'm friendly with all these police officers I think be in my commercials. But the issues...
They have also been actors.
The issues...
I'm not sure which campaign he's talking about.
The issues were never connected to the realities of the state. I mentioned the health crisis down here. There's a similar situation in Alameda County, Oakland. There's the murder situation in Oakland. San Francisco has its problem. All over the state, there are these specific problems, and you never heard anything about it in the debate.
Well, can I help you out here? Why would a sitting governor who has all these problems want to raise these issues in the minds of the voters?
Why didn't the media then?
Well, the dirty little secret is the broadcast stations in California, except for Spanish language stations, which actually do a pretty good job covering public affairs, are pathetic. They are worse than pathetic. They don't care about politics. They don't even care about government. All right. And most of the news directors think that politics kills your ratings. That even covering government, here we have a huge state with 11 media markets. There's not a single television station outside of Sacramento that not only has a bureau in Sacramento, but even has a human being posted in Sacramento because they don't care. They're out covering car chases and some woman in Riverside killing her baby and putting it in a freezer. They think that's news.
Wait a minute. I want you to know, bragging a little bit, that KCAL beat the networks on election night. People care.
So there's the ratings.
Except for KCAL.
Exactly.
Well, okay. Just I have here, and we can make copies of it and distribute it.
Not a poll, Jeff.
No, this is not a poll. These are dates, locations, and topics of policy speeches that Bill Clement gave in the general election. And I'm going to just tell you, and I work with the media a lot, and my friends, and we have, I hope, a healthy respect for each other. But I can't tell you how many times, because of the way this campaign unfolded, that Bill would go to some organization, he would give what we believe to be a substantive policy speech. He would take questions from the audience, and he would get substantive policy questions from the audience. We would go to the back of the room, have a media avail. The questions from the media would all be about the process of the scandal of the day. And then they would write stories, or the TV people would run stories that said Simon is dogged by questions about the latest scandal.
Well, Jeff, my answer is at least they were there.
Well, no, I'm glad that they're there, and it's not to say that we don't participate in it too, because we're certainly, at the same time that I'm sitting here complaining that they didn't write a great story about Bill Simmons' wonderful healthcare speech today. That afternoon, I would be on the phone with one of those reporters, or Sean Wood, or one of other people trying to spin the latest Gray Davis scandal to them. So I'm not calling us guiltless in the process, but from somebody who got into politics and still has a little bit of my purity that this should be about good government and policy and not just winning. I think the political process is a little disturbing right now. That's my personal opinion. I'm not sure how to fix it because, again, at the end of the day, if I can do something quote unquote impure to win a campaign for my client, I'm going to do that. So, and I don't mean illegal. I'm sitting here on my high horse and saying you guys should cover my policy speech, but then when Gray Davis is out giving a policy speech, I'm going to be sliding under your door all the donations you got from somebody trying to teach you to write a pay-to-play story. So, guilty as charged, but when you're doing it to my candidate, then I get to complain.
I can't believe the level of cynicism I hear here.
We probably have about 10 minutes left or so before these folks have to go for airplanes. But, Matea, you've been patiently waiting over there. So.
Thank you. I think it's important to point out that this race was close, not because so many voters went to Simon, but because people did not come out to vote.
Yeah.
And Gray Davis won about 3.1 million votes on Tuesday. That is 1.7 million less than in 1998. And Garry, you were quoted in our paper this morning blaming a lot of this on the lack of a message from the Democrats at a national level. But I was wondering if you could speak to, in the short retrospect that we've had here, how much of this do you think is due to the tenor of this campaign this year?
I don't honestly know the answer to that. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for 30 years. I've never been in a single cycle where somebody or some people were not saying this is the biggest campaign in the history of Western democracy. This is the most negative campaign in the history of Western democracy. And it's never true. It's always an exaggeration. There is no question that the tone of this campaign was largely negative. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, and Jeff has alluded to it. I mean, what you had here, if you wanted to put it in shorthand, was damaged goods versus defective product. And when you, and I've talked to some of your reporters about this. I mean, when you constantly bemoan the lack of positive commercials and positive spots. But the fact is, and voters are just as guilty of this as the press. We focus grouped a huge number of positive spots from the governor that never saw airtime. Why is that? Because when you focus group negative spots, everyone says, "Oh, I hate that. I hate mudslinging. I'll vote against anybody who does that. I hate that stuff. I turn that stuff off." So then you say, "Okay, here's some positive spots." And they pick those apart. If you have the governor saying, "Here's what I've done over the last 4 years," they say, "Well, I don't think that's true. I don't know about any of that stuff. I never heard about any of that stuff. That's not documented. That's not corroborated." And then when you say what you're going to do in the future, they say, "Well, all politicians make promises. I mean, that doesn't mean a damn thing to me." So, I mean, you're in a dilemma. What the hell do you put on the air? If you put on positive spots, nobody believes a word you say. It's just politicians blabbering and blathering and promising the moon. And then when you put on negative spots, everybody goes, "Oh, my God, this is horrible. All they're doing is criticizing each other. Why aren't they talking about the issues?" So you're between a rock and a hard place. And I do think the negative tone of the campaign did suppress voter turnout. There's no question about that. But, when you get right down to it, they had a defective product they couldn't sell on his own merits, and so all they could do was bash us. We had damaged goods that we probably couldn't sell on his own merits either, although we thought he had some. And so all we could do was, bludgeon Simon to death with a blunt object. Now, that's not a pretty sight, but that's what you're left with.
One quick question. What happened to the vaunted Latino turnout and the African-American turnout? I was appalled at the figures that
Horrible.
I saw.
Horrible. Yeah. Here's what the figures were. Latinos in 1998 were 14% of the total electorate. Everyone was projecting they'd be up to 17% by this election. We went down to 10. Blacks were at 7% in 1998. They went down to 4%. And Asians went from 6% down, 8% down to 6%. And if you want to know why the spread didn't widen with us, that's one of the reasons. We did very well in all three of those ethnic groups. We overwhelmingly carried all three of them. But you were applying those percentages, again, against a very, very low turnout base. And part of the problem is when you have a moderate Democrat, a centrist Democrat, and this is true with centrist Republicans as well. It was true with Pete Wilson. You don't have your base very juiced up. You're not doing everything they want you to do. Sometimes even when you do, they think you're doing it grudgingly and belatedly. And so it affects the level of intensity. And we saw this in our polling back in the spring of 2000. that minority voters who are Democrats were not turning away from gray, but the level of intensity, when you look at the job rating and the favorability rating, was moving out of highly favorable and highly positive, moving into kind of a more neutral territory. We saw this coming 3 years ago, literally, but there wasn't much you can do about it.
This is such a stupid question. I can't believe I'm asking it. Isn't it it's so cynical here. Isn't it the duty or the obligation, even if the focus groups don't like it? These same focus groups they were the ones who approved the LA Times various versions of the Orange County edition, all of which failed. Isn't it the obligation of a candidate to educate and elevate as well as to win?
Well, this is going to sound very cynical and fatalistic. I don't think at the stage we're at in politics with a jaded, cynical electorate and the lack of interest in politics, I don't think it's possible in a campaign to use a campaign as an educational device to bring voters from this point to that point. If voters think you're a crook, or if voters think you're an incompetent nincompoop, you can spend all the money in the world on ads telling them that you're not a crook and you're not an incompetent nincompoop. It's like telling people stop signs are green when they actually know they're red because they've seen them with their own eyes. You can't, and one of the problems Riordan had in the primary was you can't educate voters. They are where they are. You have to deal with that as a reality. He thought someone could pull all these people and bring them along, explain to them how screwed up they were and how wrong they were. You can't do that in a campaign. You don't have enough time. You don't have enough attention span on the part of the voters. And so ultimately it kind of sinks down to the point of where you have to just, cut to the chase, cut your losses, and go with what you have. And it would be nice. It's all high-toned and all that to say we ought to be educating voters and on and on. But voters are not, in a sense, willing to be educated. And just like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, if they're not willing to listen to your message and they're not willing to think that somehow there are some positive attributes about your candidacy, you are wasting your time and wasting your money trying to tell them that.
I know you folks we're coming down on the last few minutes here, and I just thought it might be useful to address two final issues, which is how does the California Republican Party rebuild from this? And Jerry might want to address what the governor of California has in his future political plan. That everybody, not everybody, but some people are speculating. Jeff and Sean, you want to go first, briefly?
Well,
is it Arnold? Is that how the?
Well, not by Gary's math that he talked about earlier, because Arnold doesn't fit the bill of someone that's got the long history in elected office and all of those things. I think there's a little bit of truth to the fact that right now. Democrats are going to have a lot more money in campaigns, and they have a million more voters or whatever the number is, so they're going to win elections. I don't know that. I think the Republican Party's problems are a lot more internal than external. I don't think there's this massive discontent within the electorate. There was definitely some anti-Republican bias in the electorate 4 years ago. There's no doubt about that. Every marginal voter was going out to vote against the Republican Party, and I think Dan Lundgren was only responsible for 10 points of his loss last time, and generic anti-Republican bias was responsible for the other 10. This time, the candidate that had more voters and more money won, I'm not one in the Republican Party that has this great angst that the Republican Party needs to completely remake itself in order to fix. There's always things you want to do better, but I don't think the Republican Party needs to become change its message on the economy or anything to do significantly better. I'd like to have more money and a few more voters. But
Sean, what about California? The rest of the country.
Well, briefly, we've got some very serious structural issues that the party has. Number one, I think we signed up on a bad apportionment deal. Maybe it's the best deal we could have gotten. Yeah. But that structurally locks us into roughly where we are from an Assembly and Senate perspective for a decade. We did, here's the bright note, I got a couple of passing references and stories, but we picked up maybe 2 or 3 Assembly seats, and potentially, I think there's still 25,000 votes out in the Arias Senate seat. That's still in play, too. That's about as well as the Republican Party could do at the legislative level, and I think it's about as well as we'll be able to do for the next decade, just on the sheer numbers of voters, unless we see dramatic changes in party registration, et cetera, number one. Number two, again, I don't think the party as an entity, again, you guys write a lot of process stories about how messed up the party is, and Sean Steele and Jerry Parsky. It doesn't really mean much with regards to baseline electoral issues. Our fundamental problem is, from a money perspective, labor unions, particularly public employee unions, are getting stronger and stronger, and their money is 99.9% Democrats. There's an inexhaustible supply of resources, and we control both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. You can do very small things in bills that make very big differences to individual labor unions and keep that money going. Republicans, because our donor base has changed, we've got more fickle and different types of people that don't always come out for us, and they can change their views. So we have a structural money problem. We have a structural problem in the legislature. And I also think, in some respects, some of the candidates that we have put forward are part of a little bit of an old school of the Republican Party. I think most of those, and I don't mean to offend conservative Republicans, but most of the old caveman Republicans or an older school of Republican generation are gone now, and you're going to see a new crop of people coming out, staking their own image and their own vision on where they want to go at the statewide level. And if they can be funded and get some sort of base, they'll be going. I do think, I don't have a debate with Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I do think his name identification is very, very high.
He did very well in
He's got a very attractive, telegenic, and gregarious personality. He did a very, very good job. Now, granted, it's more of a Democrat-oriented initiative, but he was very, very good. Amazing how he went out to the CDA and went out to all these Democrat groups, sat down and actually listened to what they had to say, brought them on board, and worked the charm with them. So the question is, can he move forward over a 4-year period? And again, this election, no one was shooting at you. It's easy to do these things in a vacuum. It's easy for Dick Riordan to be the guy that everybody wanted in the vacuum. No one was shooting at him, and he didn't have to perform. I think Schwarzenegger can, if he wishes, do very, very well. But again, he hasn't been trial by fire, and it's going to be a long 4-year process. He doesn't have to make up his mind because he's got a lot of money on his own, and he's got a lot of name identification until literally right up close to an election cycle. So, you know, if I were Mr. Schwarzenegger and he wishes to take my advice, I'd tell him to lay low for the next 3 years. Keep your stuff in policy. Don't make mistakes of just showing up and getting tripped up on policy things. And then if you decide to go at the end, use your name ID, use your money, and take it home.
Did you tell him that, Sean? Because you were doing a little bit of work.
You know, look.
You can share that with us.
To Mr. Schwarzenegger's credit, he literally is the Terminator. I mean, he's the Terminator in everything that he does. He came from Austria, said, I'm going to be the best bodybuilder, and he went out there and did 1,000 push-ups and 1,000 sit-ups, and he will do it, and he will be relentless, and he will go until he achieves his goal. And he did the same thing with the education initiative. I honestly don't think he was going to run. I mean, $30 million, he didn't like our lawsuit, but he would have been sued on the Terminator 3 for contract issues. He had other issues with other movies. So
there was a stealth strategy of someone employed here to kind of help him make the decision, right?
I don't know if he's going to run or not. I think, you know, the last experience we had in America with electing somebody out of a rather different career as governor was a professional wrestler by the name of Jesse Ventura, who turned into a bumbling buffoon and decided not to run for a second term. His popularity in Minnesota was down in the order of like 22%. Let me say this about Schwarzenegger. I don't know how to make movies, and I'm not in movies. As you can see, I don't qualify as a movie star. But the fact is, I know politics. And a guy who would do the following: a political operative of another candidate sent out a fax to press with a smart-ass memo attached to it. An article that appeared in a glossy, legitimate magazine you could get on any newsstand in America called Premiere about Arnold Schwarzenegger. And his reaction to that rather minimal provocation is to have his lawyer, his big-time lawyer in Century City, send me by messenger with return receipt requested, a 5-page letter from his lawyer threatening to sue me for defamation. And further, in the letter, tell me that the letter itself is copyrighted so that I can't even give the press the letter to make a story out of it. And then further, has his wife's attorney call me to tell me that she's pissed off and that she may sue me for defaming her husband, is not ready to run for governor of California.
Garry, just one last remark before you go, because I know you're running to Governor. Future plans. Some people have talked about the last couple of days. Do you have any plans to run a campaign in Iowa, New Hampshire anytime soon?
Well,
Do you have any plans to?
This is going to come as a shock to a lot of people, but in the 9.5 years I worked for Gray running 3 different campaigns, he and I have never had a single conversation about running for higher office ever. And I can tell you, I don't know what he's going to do. I'm not trying to shine you on. I just don't know. My commitment was to get him where he wanted to go and keep him there, and that's what I've done. What he does from this point forward is really his own decision. But I think it's very hard for a sitting governor of California to run for president. And Gray's had the unique vantage point of seeing someone try to do that in 2 different places. He was chief of staff to Jerry Brown when he tried to run twice and did it relatively badly. And he was lieutenant governor under Pete Wilson when Pete Wilson tried to run in 1995 and did it rather badly. So, I mean, Gray has seen from 2 different vantage points, sitting governors of California try to run for president and eventually hurt themselves by doing that. And I think that he probably will factor that in his decision making, but I cannot tell you what he's going to do. I don't know.
So that's
Garry,
the 2008 campaign, not a 2004 campaign.
let me.
I did my presidential campaign in '76 with Jimmy Carter.
Sean and Jeff can stay for a few more minutes if anybody else has any more questions. But Garry, I know you have to go because you're rushing to your plant, and I think we should really give a round of applause to these people who are very tired and. And Garry, we will not talk about you behind your back when you leave. Any other questions as
Thank you all very
Garry
much.
departs the room for Sean or Jeff? David, you've been more than patient, and then Mateo, I'll go back to you. Okay, David has just had his hand up. David Drucker here. So.
Jeff, I just wanted to ask you about some of the political missteps in the campaign. I mean, specifically with the tax return flap and then with the fraud verdict, although, it seemed out of left field. Usually politics 101 is, yeah, I'm a private citizen, I shouldn't have to release my tax returns, but I'm just going to get nailed on it, so let's just get it out there. It might be this impending fraud verdict, let's just get it out there. I mean, you've been around in this thing a while. I can't imagine you would counsel Mr. Simon not to release his tax returns because nobody's going to care, or the press at the very least isn't going to make a big issue out of it.
Well, just, again, sometimes in campaigns, conventional wisdom becomes fact, and it's very difficult for somebody in my position to change that. If you actually go back and look, and you'll see that, we had a bumpy week, 2 weeks after April 15th on the tax return issue, and then that issue was dead. There was not a single mention or a single substantive mention of the tax issue until the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice illegally, improperly released Bill Simon's name along with a couple hundred other people as part of an investigation in which still nobody to this day has ever said that the people that participated in that investment strategy did anything wrong. And the dispute, again, is between an accounting firm and the IRS. It's not between Bill Simon or any other investor. So, it's become sort of, again, folklore becomes reality in political campaigns, and one of the folklores that's happened in this campaign, despite our best efforts, is that Bill Simon was horribly damaged by not releasing his tax returns. Mitt Romney never released his tax returns in Massachusetts, and he won in a more liberal state. If that Wall Street Journal had not broken that story based on the IRS improperly releasing Bill Simon's name, you wouldn't be asking me that question today. So.
Can you put a microphone in front of David for folks that can't hear? Thanks. Real quick, a follow-up?
Well, yeah, and again, just go ahead.
Just for the room. What I'm saying is, the press is notorious for focusing on things that may make no sense whatsoever. And when you have... Is that true? And... No, whatever. We're not perfect here, but whatever. What I'm saying is, though, it's not like Simon was so well known before that he had a record to stand on that could supersede things that you might deem, don't matter. And that's what I'm getting at. So wouldn't it have made sense to take care of these things so that other people don't have the opportunity to spin them?
Well, again, I would if you just look at the facts, the tax return issue, I don't think did any lasting damage. The failure to release the taxes once, the IRS did what they did, and the Wall Street Journal ran the story, and then everybody else chased that story. The day that I think it was a Friday that the Wall Street Journal story ran about the tax shelter, we knew internally that day there was a question of when, not if, we'd be releasing Bill's tax returns to show that, quote unquote, he paid his fair share and all of those terms that were used. But, again, you make decisions at the time based on the best information available to you. We made a judgment that that not releasing Bill's tax returns was not going to cause us any serious damage, and I think we were right in that judgment until the Wall Street Journal story broke. So, I would love, as everybody would, have the benefit of hindsight, and say if I knew that story was coming, I would have gotten ahead of the tax return issue. Didn't have the luxury of hindsight at the time. On the fraud issue, and a friend and neighbor of Bill's who happens to be an attorney who is here, that along with me, we sort of steeped ourselves in that issue after it broke. But I mean, I was aware of the Pacific Coin investment that Bill's investment firm had made. I was aware of the fact that they discovered after that investment that their partner in that was a major drug smuggler from a couple of decades before. And I was aware that there was a lawsuit pending on that. But I was in contact with the lawyers on that. We knew that was coming down. And the issue on that, as far as we were concerned, was always why would Bill Simon, a former federal prosecutor and somebody who handled drug cases, why was he in business with one of the largest drug smugglers in American history, which, again, I didn't know at the time. There was no question in our mind, and again, the judge ultimately proved us right on that. There was no question that Bill Simon's firm was never going to be found liable for fraud. Everybody can laugh at that line, by the way. I mean, I talked to the lawyers in the case. I talked to the investment partners at Bill's firm that handled that investment for him and were witnesses at the trial. And the day before the jury verdict, the voicemail message I had on my phone from somebody at Bill's firm was, "This is coming out soon. We're afraid that the other side may go public to try to embarrass Bill because of Paul Hindelang's, or Ed Hindelang's, what's his name again? Paul Edward Hindelang, because of his criminal past. They may try to go public to try to embarrass Bill and force a settlement. But on the legal question, there's no doubt we're going to win. We had preliminary rulings from the judge that indicated that he believed there was absolutely no basis for a finding of fraud against Bill's firm. And so, again, hindsight is hindsight, and that's great. But the best advice we had available to us is, by going forward, what we've been doing is, and Gary's admitted publicly and admitted again here today, he was not even aware of that trial. They knew nothing about it until the press release came out from the lawyers from the other side saying, we just won this big trial against Bill Simon. And their strategy was always to try to force a settlement on Bill's firm so that his gubernatorial campaign would not be damaged. And they were going to do it in that fashion. So us putting that out ahead of the verdict, when we had no legal reason to believe that the verdict would go against us, we would be exposing ourselves to the only potential damage we saw from that case, which was associating Bill Simon with a drug smuggler. So we had no interest, knowing the information we knew at the time, to go forward publicly and do the damage control, tell it first and tell it yourself, which has become the truism in politics. But again, people ended up focusing on the fraud verdict. The fraud verdict was not going to happen, and there's no reason that it should have. And ultimately, 6 weeks after the fact, the judge corrected the legal mistake that the jury made. So the information we had available to us is, there's no way we lose the court case, so we didn't go out and tell everybody that Bill Simon, was doing business with a drug smuggler.
All right, I'm going to have to wrap up just for room considerations as well. It's ticking toward 10:30. But I want to say that I think Sean and Jeff will be available for a few questions as we close here, basically off the podium. I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. I want to thank particularly our panel once again, both Sherry Bebitch Jeffe, my colleague and dear friend, and also Bill Boyarsky, as well as Sean and Jeff. These are tired people that agreed to get up at 8 and 8:30 in the morning, well, 6 actually, to get down here, right? Traffic considered. And we thank you very, very much.
Bill, thanks.
And finally, I just want to also thank the audience for joining us as well this morning. Thank you.